My name is Dr. Sada Bougary from Saudi Arabia, and then I finished my medical school there, went to the US, finished Pittsburgh residency and fellowship. So I'm adult trained and then subspecialized in children. After that, I did a subspecialty within trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. With that comes a lot of abuse and mistreatment of children. So I had to find myself actually very interested in child protection and looking at what that might be here in the Middle East as compared to the US or any place else that we may have trained. So one of the biggest things I think we had to figure out when we came to the Middle East is how do we focus on child protection? What do we do? Because I think there's different systems depending on the countries and depending on the region. There's different understandings of what child protection is, and before protection, what safeguarding is. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of that, but I will give a brief summary of what I've learned since being back from the US since 2014, working in Saudi Arabia, and then working here in the UAE. I was the chair of the committee at Jalila Children's Hospital in developing the Child Safeguarding and Protection Committee, and that gave me an opportunity to gain a lot of experience within the UAE. We had patients coming from all over the world, so that helped us get a connection and understand what we needed to do as clinicians. So I'll go ahead and get started then. My slide will move. Give me just a second. There we go. I don't have any financial disclosures. I think it's important to share information and be a team, even within the context of having different institutions. Our agenda for today, we'll be talking about some definitions, the history of child rights recognition, because there's a difference, and I think we need to recognize that between having child's rights laws and having child protection or safeguarding laws. Case example, something to help us understand what we're talking about, UAE laws and resources within the country, strengths and barriers to child protection in general, and then we'll have time for some discussion and open-ended questions. In order to understand where we're at within the UAE, I think it's important to understand that it is a very new country, and in only just 50 years, they've made huge strides as a country in terms of child rights, child safeguarding, and child protection. If we look at the screen down here, I don't know if you can see my pointer. For the UK, it was 1889 when they first decided there's a law. They put a law in place and they said, actually, children have rights and we can go into a home and remove a child from their home if they're not safe. So we're playing catch up in the Middle East. It's many, many years ago that this happened in the UK. They've had hundreds of years to get things in place and the system in place. I think a lot of the systems that we compare to here are from overseas. It's important to look at where we're at in the country we're living and help support these kinds of initiatives. Within the Middle East and North African area, we can see that we recently only started to understand that there was a need for child rights. So 2016 is when the UAE initiated and finally ratified and signed the Wadima law, which gave children rights separate and independent to their families. That's not to say that children didn't have rights before 2016. This just means that there was an independent law recognizing specific rights for children within the UAE. So the history of child rights and recognition, the UAE was launched in 2016. In India, which is our neighbor, and we have a lot of expats from India, it was in 1957. Again, we're just trying to look at the perspective. I think that a lot of us want to do a lot for the kids that we see. We just don't know how to do it. We have to have a perspective and understanding. This is very recent. It's going to be some growing pains, and we are part of that process. So being able to be part of that process and help support this is one of the things we want to really focus on. For Dubai, I'll focus on Dubai a little bit. There is Dubai Women and Children's Foundation. For a very long time, they were the only NGO, non-governmental organization within the UAE. They had been commissioned to look at, explore, record, and protect the rights of children for many years, even before 2016. They had been collaborating with Dubai Police and with Community Development Authority Child Protection Division, in addition to other entities. They were collaborating within Dubai and outside of the Emirate of Dubai. So they had a big initiative that they were working on throughout many, many years. And the plan was to have them be in charge of the child protection, in addition to women's rights and women's protection. And if you go ahead and take a look at their websites, you'll find a lot of different resources that are local.
I love to play outside, but I know you hate it when I get my designer clothes messy. Are my clothes more valuable than my childhood?
I really try my best at school, but you're still not proud of me. Do you love me less because of my grades?
I know I'm not as sociable as my sister. Do I embarrass you because I'm different? Mom? Dad? Can you love me the way I am?
After that, we have Community Development Authority, who came into play a few years ago, even stronger than the Dubai Women and Children's Foundation, after a decision by the Executive Council here in Dubai. So they are the primary persons or entity in charge of child safeguarding and protection. Let's take a case, just so we have our minds thinking about things. Typical example is a little boy called Abdullah, who is a 10-year-old local Emirati. He identifies as cisgender heterosexual male. He has autism spectrum disorder. He's being seen for his post-emergency room visit, follow-up for a fall during football practice. So Abdullah was playing football. He's a high-functioning autistic kiddo that was playing football. He had a fall. He went to the emergency room, and now this is the follow-up appointment. In this follow-up appointment, there's bruises and scratches on his arms and legs. A 10-year-old typically does have bruises and scratches on their legs. It's pretty common, especially if we're being told he had a fall during football, and this is a follow-up. We're expecting this. The clinician noticed that these bruises and scratches were more than expected for what we would for 10-year-olds. So she started to talk to Mom, and Mom reports that the bigger bruises and scratches are from a 16, which is not brother interactions. So Mom didn't think anything of it. The clinician is now thinking about, yes, it's a kiddo that's 10 years old, but there was a suspicion about the intensity and the depth of the bruises and scratches. A 16-year-old and a 10-year-old may not be the ideal situation to say this is typical brother-sister interactions. At 16 years old, typically kids are more mature than to have these kinds of interactions. So we start to think about things. Is there someone at risk? Do we have to do something here? What supports are needed if we think that this is a child at risk or more than one person at risk? What are their priorities that we need to take into account? Who should be contacted? In what order? What follow-up plans should be set in place? What are the resources available? And if we had an interactive discussion right now, I can imagine some people telling me that actually a 10-year-old and 6-year-old is pretty normal for them to be fighting and scuffing, and it's normal. Sometimes it can be normal. We have to have a conversation with the child. We have to have a conversation with Mom, understand better what the context of these interactions are. The degree of scratching and bruising makes a difference. That's a whole different discussion of how to spot child abuse or child protection issues. For now, we're just looking at the resources. So keeping in mind this flow, we're just going to go a little bit back in history now and talk about child protection rights internationally. So in 1989, quite a few years ago, UNICEF sat and said there are 4 core principles for child's rights. They were ratified in 1989. So non-discrimination is one of the child's rights internationally. All children should have a right to non-discrimination regardless of where they're born, their ethnicity, their religion, their sexual orientation. There's absolutely no reason that we shouldn't help a child any place in the world. Devotion to the best interests of the child. And I think one of the biggest things that we may have observed is that sometimes, and this is internationally, not just in the Middle East, North African area, that children, because they are smaller, because they are quieter, their rights aren't as important as adults sometimes. And we forget that their rights are just as important as adults, and they're harder to fight for because they don't have the capacity to speak up as much as an adult would, and they don't have the legal ability to make decisions yet. In addition to that, they are children, so their frontal lobes are not fully developed. They don't have the capacity to make full decisions on their own. So in addition to ensuring that they have those rights, we have to remember that prioritizing our children's rights means that we have to step back, look at the context of what's happening, and then really genuinely think what is in the best interest of the child, not the best interest of the persons around them, the systems around them, the child first, and then everything else. The child has a right to life, survival, and development. Under that comes a myriad, honestly, of rights, including vaccination, ability to have clean water, appropriate food, shelter, appropriate emotional supports, etc. Respects for the views of a child. So kids have a right to say, I don't agree, but this is my point of view. This can be taken into any cultural context, and we can modify it to make it appropriate, regardless of the country, the social structure, the religious structure. Being able to have a right to have a view doesn't mean that they are disrespectful. And I think that's something that we can have conversations about many, many times, especially because we're in the mental health care offices. We have lots of conversations with parents about how to show respect to their children and how children can show respect within a normative cultural context. This also happens, I'm hoping, with a lot of general pediatricians, because you're the first line when kids come into the healthcare system. So we said in 2016, it was ratified that children within the UAE will have specific rights. And that's Federal Law Number 3, or Wadima's Law. This was named Wadima's Law based on a child who lost her life in the UAE after she had been, unfortunately, severely beaten and tortured by her family, her biological father, and the stepmother. She had a sister who survived, who was also tortured, unfortunately, that is apparently doing well. That law came into place and said, from that day on, there are very definite rights that children have that must be respected. 2 years later, we had the Cabinet Resolution number 52 that governed the Wadima rights of children. The majority of that law looked at the first line of defense, which is schools. It looked at schools and what schools have a right to do. It looked at ensuring that we had child advocates, that there are trained personnel that can come in, help the schools identify abuse, do an assessment, and then decide what are the next steps. In addition to that, they decided that there would be child advocates in courts to ensure that we had the best interest of the child at the forefront. So again, 2018 isn't that far back. It's very recent, but there's been a lot of progress in a very short time. So what are child rights laws in UAE? It's a whole document. It's out there. I believe at the end we have a link that you can go ahead and take a look at the law. I would recommend anybody dealing with children to read the 2016 and the 2018 laws. That'll help you understand what are the laws within the UAE so that you can then implement them and have a conversation with your managers, with your leadership, and whatever institutions you're in, to know what they're going to be able to support. So we'll just look at the types of rights that were instigated. So children had fundamental rights. The child had specific rights. There were family rights identified, social rights, cultural rights, educational, and a right to protection. So it categorized the different rights that would be given to children within the UAE. And again, it's non-discriminatory, so any child born within the UAE, regardless of their background. Because we're talking about child protection, Article 33 within the Wadima law, it looks at the consideration. These are what are considered to be threatening to the child, to his or her physical, psychological, moral, or mental integrity. I think it's important to note that they talked about physical, psychological, moral, because it is a country that follows Sharia and Islamic law. In addition to that, they have the ability to follow other laws. Wadima law is a federal law which gives all children within the country these rights within the cultural context of that child and the child's family. Mental integrity, which requires his or her right to protection. So loss of both parents and living without a breadwinner or tutor. Children are not allowed to be homeless within the UAE. Children's exposure to neglect, rejection, and homeless. Every child has a right for somebody to be their protector. Regardless of who that person is, it must be an adult that can provide that to the child. Obvious and continuous default in education and care. Children have a right and must be in school, regardless of what that schooling may be. All children within the UAE have a right to education. Habitual child abuse, and that's defined differently for each person, I would imagine. What we have to do is go back to the law and read it and understand what child abuse is, how child abuse is defined within UAE. Child's exposure to exploitation or sexual abuse. That's a quite obvious one. We are not allowed to exploit children or be sexually abusive to children. That holds true for children within their own family being abused, within schools or any other institutions or other places within the UAE. That also includes online. Child's exposure to exploitation by illegal organizations and the organized crime. The UAE, and especially Dubai, has a very international airport. It makes it easier for child trafficking. It makes it easier for persons that are trying to propagate child pornography to use children within the UAE for these things. What the UAE is saying is that we understand that this is a risk to the children within the UAE. We've now said the child has a right, and we've defined it, to not be part of these kinds of activities. And there are penalties associated with the activities. There are penalties associated with not reporting these penalties. Children's exposure to begging or economic exploitation. I don't know if our attendees today have ever seen that, but quite a few years ago, there were children that were on the streets, and it was an organized crime, actually, syndicate that would take children and choose a specific type of child that would go to beg because they would make more money for them. So that's been banned from before. This has just said, listen, we're not going to tolerate this at all ever again, and it's part of the law now. Inability of parents or custodian to provide care or raise the child. So one of the things that was really emphasized when we talked about child rights and Wadima law is that the child has a right to have a holding environment. A holding environment as a physical and emotional holding environment. A physical holding environment is a home and parents or adults that can take care of them. They provide that emotional structure for the child. So every child has to have some sort of physical environment in addition to an emotional environment, regardless if they're blood related or not. Child exposure to kidnapping, sale, or trafficking for any purpose or exploitation of any form. There were quite a few children that had been sent over by their families or sold by their families, unfortunately, that found themselves within the UAE and other places in the world that were being trafficked. UAE again said this is something that's very clear now that it is illegal. A child has a right not to be sold into these kinds of environments. And there are penalties for doing these things. There are penalties for not reporting them. Psychological or mental disability that affects the child's ability to perception. So all children have a right for physical, psychological well-being. And this comes into play to identify the specific or identified to make it clearer for anybody coming to the country. We now have to follow through on this law. So after the 2018 law came out, there was a lot of discussion about how to train, who would be responsible for the training, who would take the lead. Lots of initiatives came out, and I think there's still a lot more room for these initiatives to progress. We have the Early Childhood Authority, who trained child protection specialists. They actually launched, trained, and certified at least 10 2 years ago now. So I'm sure there's a lot more that have been coming out. The community centers have been doing trainings. We have the Ministry of Community Development, the Ministry of Interior, Dubai Police, Community Development Authority have all been doing different trainings for child specialists in order to ensure that we have a good number to help follow through on everything that we do need to follow through. These are, again, just examples. So if we look at resources, what are the resources if we feel there's any questions, if there's a report that we need to make, how can we report these kinds of situations? And if you remember, Abdullah, if we have a question about that, what can we do? So as we know, within the UAE, there's federal laws and then there's emirate laws. So there's federal laws that govern the whole country. Each emirate has sub-laws to govern the implementation of these federal laws. And they have their separate entities within each emirate too. So the Minister of Interior They have a legal branch, and the child protection number there is 116-111. They have a 24/7 hotline that you can call and ask questions. You can make reports. You can have discussions about any kind of reports that you've made. They're not always, just to be fully clear, they're not always available. I think that as clinicians, sometimes we call and we don't get an answer right away. We stop. We should not stop. We should call back because they are getting a large number of calls, and we have to ensure that the call that we're making goes through. The Ministry of Community Development and the Resource Branch, they are developing a lot of child protection officers. They have a lot of initiatives that are underway, and we're looking forward to seeing the results. Within Dubai, we had the Community Development Authority. If the abuse happened in Dubai, it has to go through the Community Development Authority. They have a very simple, straightforward number, 800-988. They have an email that you can send things to. They also have an online website that clearly states what are the requirements for child abuse reporting. If we're in a clinic and we feel that the child cannot go home, we have to protect the child here and now. We have to ensure that the child is safe before they walk out the door. We should call the 999 number. They have a child protection division within the police. It is their responsibility then to contact child protection services within their police division to help facilitate protection of the child that is in the clinic with you. So when we call 999, we have to explain to them that we have a child, that we are a clinician. These are our concerns, and we have to be very specific about the concerns and ask for somebody to be sent over to the clinic. They have specialists that can be sent. The specialists typically are plain clothes, and they have male and female specialists. We had, as we've mentioned previously, the NGO, which is Dubai Foundation for Women and Children. It's 800-111. Right now, Dubai Foundation for Women and Children, their mandate is for the protection of women. They still have a lot of services for protection of children. Community Development Authority will coordinate with them if the child needs placement. So what would happen if we had a child that urgently needed to be placed? The Community Development Authority collaborate with the police and the medical facility that created the report, or the school that created the report, in addition to Dubai Women and Children's Foundation. The Dubai Foundation for Women and Children have housing within Dubai, Sharjah, and Abu Dhabi, in addition to coordinating with hotels and other places if they don't have enough housing for the kids and mothers and sometimes fathers that need housing. So it's a lot of changes, I think, that are happening, and I think because there's a lot of developments, things change very quickly. For now, the Community Development Authority is the main source for child protection queries and reports. So if we're talking about strengths and barriers, there's a lot more increased social awareness for child safeguarding and protection within the UAE. I think it's important to note that there was a lot of discussion about the child is within the family and therefore they are just part of that family. The recognition that children have rights outside of the family is a new concept to the cultural norm right now. And it's important to understand that this is something that's changing. We're recognizing that children have rights outside of the family, again, within the respectful cultural context, but there is a recognition. There's clear basic procedures. We have rights that came out, and then we had governing law that came out in 2018. So there are procedures that should be followed, and each ministry and entity has to develop their own procedures and follow them, depending on the area that they cover. Identified involved entities, a lot of sharing happens, and I think there's still development to be had. Assigning child protection officers across all governmental sectors. I think that's one of the biggest developments that happened, and it's one of the toughest things to do, because we have to have child protection officers that are trained across all of the Emirates, able to engage in many, many languages with many cultures, and have a legal background in addition to a psychological background. And they have parameters for these officers, which are clearly stated in the laws. So doing those kinds of trainings is very important. These child protection officers also have the right to remove a child from their home, which is a big difference than previous years. So before this, only the police could do that with the judge signing off on it. So only the police could do that with the district attorney signing off on it from a judge. Now the child protection officers themselves can actually say, we are able to remove these children from their home if they think that there's clear or present danger to the child's well-being. The commitment and growing interest towards child protection and safeguarding. There's been a lot of different trainings, a lot of interest, many discussions. As you see, there's a good number of attendees here today. There's a growing interest in understanding what this means for this country and for the region. What are the barriers that we might see? Unfamiliarity of the importance of interprofessional and interagency collaboration. NABLT for UAE, for Dubai, is coming out, and we have other entities within the UAE to help us as clinicians to collaborate more. There's a discussion, but it's not been launched yet, is my understanding, have a centralized child protection website of some sort. Unfamiliarity of the legal aspects of child safeguarding and protection. There's a lot of discussions happening in schools. We have a lot of entities going into schools and discussing these kinds of rights with children. Here in Dubai, the Dubai police have done a lot of talks with the kids. They have books that they published. CDA has books that they published. Dubai Women Foundation has lots of books. So there's a lot of education still happening, and it needs to continue. Limited education and training opportunities for those willing to fill some of the remaining gaps. So there's always gaps, and I think because there is still some unfamiliarity with what this may entail, and culturally it's not fully accepted within the Middle East, North African region, there's still some gaps in people willing to go in and get those trainings. Unclear career paths. So right now, a lot of persons graduating from any kind of universities within the UAE have a career path that they would go into once they graduate from their bachelor's. They may do a master's and a PhD within that same specialty. For child protection officers, they can go in from two different pathways, either a legal pathway or a mental health psychological pathway, then be trained. There still isn't a lot of clarity about what happens after that. Once they're trained as child protection officers, what's the next step? How do they progress? Again, still in a discussion. It's early days, but it's a good development that's happening. So if we break down the barriers to disclosure, and this is something that I've seen very common, honestly, in the years that I've been working in child protection within Saudi and in UAE, there's youth, employees, family, and friends. So anybody can report child abuse. The youth themselves, employees of any kind, schools, healthcare, any employee. Even in the malls, they can report child abuse. Family and friends. And one of the biggest things that we have to focus on is family and friends, because that's the one that we tend not to think of. And we think that family and friends are the safest people. Hopefully they are, for the most part, the safest people, but they do have the greatest access to children, and therefore they can be the most unsafe persons to children. So kids, they fear if they report their parent or their uncle or their cousin, whoever it may be that's abusing them, that they will be left alone, that they may not be taken care of. And again, they're kids, their frontal lobes are not fully developed. We understand that they don't think things completely fully through. Hopelessness about solutions. If I call and nobody does anything, I'm not going to call again. Even if I'm being abused, I don't feel that anybody can help. Fear of impact on others, and this is internationally, this is not just for the UAE. Fear of impact on others. If I call and I report my dad for hitting me, the dad might be taken away, and he's the main breadwinner, therefore our family will be destitute. And kids can't think that far. They have a good imagination, and their anxiety can take them very, very, very big places. Communication difficulties. They don't know how to express themselves. They call, they don't know what to say, they just say something that sounds benign. And if the caller, the person receiving the call, doesn't know how to ask the questions and doesn't know how to send somebody into the house, that call may be missed, that abuse report may be missed. Inappropriate medication. So children that are afraid that they may be put on medication, or may be afraid that something may happen to them or their parents in terms of being abused by the medical community, can be fearful of calling. Poor awareness of rights. One of the biggest changes that happened when they started educating kids about Wadima law is that they had a big upsurge in kids calling and saying, my mother or my father's abusive, they won't let me watch my iPad, they won't let me watch TV. So there had to be re-education about what are the rights of a child and when is appropriate time to call child protection. Acceptance. So children accepting and understanding that this is considered abuse and that I can call and get help takes a lot of education. And a big part of that is us as parents helping our children understand that they have rights and their friends have rights. They can get support. Low self-esteem and guilt. If they feel that if they have been abused for a long time, they don't feel that they have a right to protection. This is one of the hardest things to help children recover from. The staff and volunteers, they don't know what abuse is. They can't spot it. They don't know it when they see it. Fear of being labeled a troublemaker. This is one of the biggest ones I've seen. A lot of people will call and say, listen, I've seen this. I don't want to make the report myself because I'm worried then they won't come back to me, the family. I'm worried that people won't refer to me. I'm worried that XYZ. They know that this is abuse. They understand that it's abuse, but they don't want to be the whistleblower. Cultural, institutional issues may have been drawn into behaviors. So if there's a bullying culture, especially within UAE, it's such an eclectic culture, a group of cultures, that what one person will consider abuse, another person will consider discipline. And I think that's why it's important for all of us to read the law, understand what the law says, and know what our rights are as clinicians, know what the children's and families' rights are within the country that we're living in and we're practicing in, so that we can differentiate. This is considered abuse under the law or not. The bigger abuses, the sexual abuse, the clear physical abuse, etc., most people can agree on, but there are some nuances that can become confusing. And then having discussions with your leadership, having discussions with your colleagues, your associates. What are we planning? How are we defining it? What does the institution that I'm working in have as their policies? Do they have a child protection policy? Do they have a pathway, a workflow for reporting or not? If they don't, it's worth talking to the leadership about how do we get this in place. Stigma of being the whistleblower, as we had said, being ostracized or victimized. Sometimes there's persons that are afraid of being threatened by the families. There really genuinely hasn't been any kind of real threat. It's been mostly yelling, shouting because they don't appreciate being told that they're going to have child protection services called. That can be avoided most of the time, 99.9% of the time, by explaining to the family this isn't a punishment, this is for support. Typically, families don't abuse their children for the fun of it. They don't abuse their children because they want to abuse their children. They're abusing their children because they don't have the resources they need to be the parent that they'd like to be. Having that discussion before calling child protection services diffuses the situation tremendously. A lot of the parents are actually grateful if they understand that, listen, we're calling child protection services because we want to get resources in place. We want to see what kind of financial, physical, emotional, mental health resources can be provided to you and to your family. Not wanting to tell on colleagues and protecting friends. Sometimes we don't want to call. Our colleague is telling us a story about how they did XYZ to their children, and we identify that as abuse. We're having conversations with them, and they're not understanding that this is something that they need to stop. We're worried about the children, but we're worried that if we do report, the colleague then knows that we're the ones that reported. Again, having a conversation about, listen, these are resources to get in place, getting supports from within the community that colleague is in is very important. Viewing child protection reports as a punishment is never helpful. Child protection services should be called in as a support to the family and the child. Burnout or stress. And again, it's an international, these are international barriers, not just for the UAE. So we share this with everybody else around the world. We do get burned out and we do get stressed. And after a few times of seeing the same kind of things happening again and again and feeling like we don't have hope as clinicians, we tend not to call. That happens. When we find ourselves doing that, the best thing we can do is try to take care of ourselves, get rid of the burnout and the stress, adjust the burnout and stress causers, try to stop it from happening again. Looking for supports in our organizations, looking for supports in our families, in our friends, looking for different opportunities so that we don't find ourselves in these situations. Because the children do have a right to protection, and we have an obligation towards them, take care of ourselves to be able to take care of them. Fear of loss of promotion, job, and references. I hear this a lot. I've never seen this happen. Nobody has ever lost their job, lost a promotion, or lost any kind of positive references because they've engaged child protection services. Quite the opposite. It is mandated by law that we do report. So not reporting would actually predispose us to lose our promotion, potentially lose a job, and potentially not have good references. The fear is actually the opposite of what is. When we're doing these kinds of things to protect our children within the country, because this is mandated by law, we're more likely to be respected by colleagues and by leadership. Lack of understanding, again, we just touched on that. People think that, yes, I do need to protect children. I do want to follow the right kind of process to ensure that children are protected, but I don't know what to do. So go back to your organization, go back to your direct manager, go back to your manager's boss, go to whoever you need to go to in the organization to say, I don't know how to protect children within the UAE. I know that I'm a mandated reporter. I don't know how to do this. What can we do? And many, many hospitals and institutions within the UAE have developed policies, procedures, and workflows for child safeguarding and protection. It's still early days, so I don't think that all of the employees are aware of this. We do have to go back and ask. The attitude and indifference of not being bothered, very shocking to read maybe as clinicians, but you would see a lot of people that just don't want to get involved. They just don't want to get involved. They want to do their 9 to 5, go home, and not have any kind of headaches from this. And again, this is international. It's not just for the UAE or the North African Middle East area. This is internationally. People just can't be bothered to make the report. It is extra work. We have to know that, but it's worth that extra work. Past experiences of reporting. Again, as I said, I worked in the US, I worked in Saudi, I worked in the UAE. All 3 countries that I worked in, there have been positive experiences and not so positive experiences. Not because there's any kind of cultural context or anything like that. It's resources. If there aren't resources to allocate to every single child that has a report, they have to decide which child has a priority. And life-threatening abuse takes a priority for resources in terms of financial and manpower. Everything else comes after that. Denial or disbelief. A child reports that their father is sexually abusing them. For example, that's one of the biggest ones that we see that people do not want to believe because they genuinely want to believe that the father and the mother or the parents are protecting their children, not abusing them. We have to believe every single child tells us I'm being abused. Now, if they're telling us that we're being abused by this specific person, we believe them. And we get the right kind of person in place to ask them the right kind of questions so that we can help them understand and find out from them if this is abuse that's happening from the specific person. Sometimes kids will say, this person's abusing me because they don't feel safe enough to say, to blow the whistle on the other person who's actually abusing them. So we have to believe them and say, I believe you. We have to validate their experience and get the right kind of person into the room with the child so they can help them. Fear of hierarchy. That one happens a lot, internationally, not just in the Middle East, where people don't want to report. They just want to say to whoever's their manager, whoever's their senior, you take the responsibility. Again, afraid of blame and shame. Unfortunately, this exists, but we have to understand that there is no blame and shame. This should be a point of pride. I noticed something. I decided that this is child abuse or child neglect or whatever it may be. Based on my clinical experience, based on the laws that I'm following within the country I'm practicing in, I'm going to go ahead and report it. Definitely get the support of your managers, your leadership, your seniors, 100%. But be the person that protects that child. When a child is let down by an adult, when they're being abused, they're less likely to report it again. So we have to be that person that hears the children. Family and friends, denial. Oh no, he didn't mean it. That's the most common comment we've heard. They didn't mean it that way. It doesn't matter how they meant it. If the child says, listen, I felt this way when I was treated this way, we believe the child because that was the child's experience. We believe the child's experience. Now, what we do after that depends on what's needed for the child and what actually happened. The reality is that the child experienced it as abuse, then we have to take it seriously and validate that for the kiddo. Not wanting outside interference, especially in closed cultures where there's shame in getting anybody involved, even police, even child social services. Even asking help from a psychologist, psychiatrist, or pediatrician, from anybody sometimes can be shameful. We don't air out our dirty laundry is one of the things that's commonly said. Now, we don't air out dirty laundry, but we do want to make sure that the child is safe within the context of their family. And we do have to really emphasize for the kids and for the families that there is confidentiality, that our ethics prevent us from discussing any kind of details we're talking about with anybody outside of them without their permission or without a legal precedent. So we have to have a court order to say we have to share information. Otherwise, we're not sharing information without their consent. The only time we'd break that kind of confidentiality is if somebody's at risk of death. The child or somebody in the family or another person is at risk of death. Typically, we'd still have a conversation because communication is key. We'd have a conversation with the child, with their family, and saying, well, I am going to be breaking confidentiality because these are my concerns and my fears. Let's do this together. 9 times out of 10, actually 9.9 times out of 10, this goes very smoothly. We then have actual consent to share information, and things go much nicer after that. If we don't surprise families with things, they're less likely to get anxious and less likely to get aggressive verbally or physically with us. Shame and stigma. There's a lot of shame and stigma surrounding not being able to protect our children from within our family. Most people in the world would like to think that their child is safe when they're at home and they close their door. They would not like to think that the partner that they married or the child that they bared or the cousin that came in that they're helping this visiting would be an abuser to their child. This does happen though, and it's very common because the biggest instigator for child abuse is access. When a person has access to children, they are more likely to be abusive. They don't have access to kids next door. They don't necessarily have access to kids at school. They don't have access to kids in a mall. That access is harder. Kids at home are the easiest. Admitting that our child was abused within our own home can be one of the biggest challenges a parent can have. So supporting them through this, validating their experience, understanding that they feel stigma and shame is important, and letting them have a space to sit with this discomfort is key. Cultural context. One of the reasons we had a delay in the Middle East is that we've had many discussions about what this might mean culturally for the families here, but not wanting to take cultures from other countries and implement them directly here, which makes sense. We have to look at the culture within the country that we're living in and develop the standards that would be appropriate for these cultures. Financial loss and consequences. If the breadwinner is taken away because the abuser is taken away out of the house, there's shame associated with it. The family is not happy to be associated with. The cultural differences have a place here too. That could prevent people from reporting. Feeling powerless and fear of repercussions. A kid says, listen, my ex-family member is doing XYZ. I've told somebody in my family, and they've now told me that if I report them, the family will no longer talk to me because I'm the whistleblower, I'm the troublemaker, I should just be quiet. I've heard that several times in clinic. It happens here and in the US and in Saudi. They're just afraid because they love their family and they don't want to lose their family, and that makes sense. They don't feel that they can be supported by other family members and to report. So what we do is we empower the children and their family members to go ahead and make the report in the best way possible. It's a bad circumstance, but there is a best way possible. Fear of losing or taking responsibility. So again, the same concept as we had talked about with employees, but within a family context. Abuse has been going on for 3 to 4 years. Kids didn't feel that they could stop it. They find the report and then they get told, why didn't you say something sooner? A very common response is a natural response. It's frustrated. It comes from a very caring place, but it can make the child feel like, oh, I didn't do anything sooner. I must have been bad. Fear of effect on others. Again, same concept. What will happen if I talk to somebody in my family about what happened? How will they now see me? How will they view me? Right? So we have to make sure that we're being very careful and cautious about how we're reporting. Collusion. Sorry, didn't mention collusion. So people will think that if I talk to somebody and they don't believe me, and they don't make a report, and they don't protect me, they may be actually colluding with the person that's abusing me. They may think that this is okay to happen, and therefore I need to be quiet. We have to ensure that whenever we're talking to children, we're sitting with open our hands, we're talking about their protection and prioritizing them, letting them know whatever they tell us is valid. Not wanting that tension. So I've already been abused so many times. I've made these reports. People come in, they talk, they do all kinds of things, and they leave, and abuse continues again. Or the abuse stops, and people are just keep talking about this. At some point, we don't want that kind of attention, so we don't want to invoke any kind of reports. There's no evidence. Many times there's no evidence, and if a child or a family member thinks I can't prove it, they just think we shouldn't report it. It's better to report and let the professionals find the evidence than not to report. Not wanting the family broken up. Better to report and get the person that's abusing the therapy and the help that they may need to keep the family together rather than breaking the family up by keeping the abuse going, because the abuse itself breaks the family. Previous abuse or other things to hide. So if something else is happening, that happens very common, and they're just worried about the reputation of the family because the abuse has happened, yes, but there's something else happening too, which may come out when they report the abuse. They're more likely to be quiet about it. So how do we overcome these barriers? There's lots of them. What do we do as clinicians? We just be there. We make sure the child feels heard. We make sure the child understands that we trust them and believe them no matter what they say. How do we prove ourselves? We take the time to listen and respond. We call our nurse and say, listen, I have a case that's going to have to go overtime. Please schedule the patients for the next hour or whatever it may be. Have the right attitude. Don't be too shocked. So it is shocking, and we will hear shocking things. We have to keep an outer calmness about us, even if we're scared inside or shocked inside, whatever's happening inside. The outside has to be calm and collected. Know what we're talking about. Again, go talk to colleagues. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. I think that's an important thing to do, is educate ourselves. Go away from today and have conversations with everybody around you about, what do I know about child safeguarding and protection within the UAE? What do I do if somebody comes from outside the country? Because we have a lot of medical tourism within the UAE. What should I do? Talk to your leadership. What should clinics do, recommended to do? Have clear pathways, right? So make sure that everybody in the clinic knows what to do and identify it, and that it's culturally relevant, because we are such a big cultural melting pot / salad of persons in the UAE. Have social services available. So social workers are something I think is still early days within the UAE, Middle East, North African area. I'm hoping that we have more social workers that are trained, and I'm hoping we have more child protection officers that can be put out into this world so that we can have those supports. Have services and psychological support. So don't put our psychologists and our psychiatrists and our social workers in the back corner of the hospitals and institutions. Have them front and center. Have them interacting with ourselves as clinicians and with our patients, so this becomes normal. So who was at risk? Abdullah was at risk. His 16-year-old sister was at risk, and mom and anybody else in that household is at risk, because a 16-year-old and a 10-year-old hitting and fighting physically so much that there's tons of bruises on a 10-year-old. I can imagine what the 16-year-old looks like. She's probably bruised up and injured too. And it feels bad from her perspective too, that she's beating up her little brother. Psychologically, that doesn't feel good. Anybody in the house witnessing this is at risk too of being psychologically injured from these kinds of events. What supports are needed? Sitting with the kiddo and helping him understand that, no, we don't hit like this. This isn't normal. We don't want this 10-year-old to grow up and think this is normal. When I'm frustrated, I hit, kick, scream, and shout. We have to get our transdisciplinary teams in place, get our psychologists in there, have a conversation with mom about, well, maybe something could be different. What would it look like if they were verbal and they're expressing themselves verbally instead of hitting, scratching, biting? What are the priorities? Making sure that Abdullah is not at risk, because if he's got scratches and bruises, there may be other kicks that have happened, punches that have happened. There may be head injuries, there may be internal injuries. We have to have a conversation with mom and Abdullah about, we need to investigate more. It was missed in the emergency room, unfortunately, emergency department. But in the clinic, we have a little bit more time. So we slow things down. If we can't do that today, we have a good conversation with mom, build a good rapport, bring her back with more time later, if there's no clear imminent danger to the child that day. Who should be contacted? Your colleagues. So whenever we're faced with these kinds of situations, we want to first reach out to our colleagues and then reach out to the leadership within the institution, look for guidance, and then decide where help needs to be found. What follow-up plan should be set in place? Definitely should be seen within an X amount of time, depending on the circumstance. With this kiddo, within a week to 2 weeks maximum, unless there's a very big red flag of an imminent danger towards him or his family. With follow-up with social workers, psychologists, etc. So that week is giving us enough time as clinicians to put things into place. So when they come in the next time, we have different supports to give them. Don't refer out and then not follow up, because then they're lost to follow up. What are the resources available in Dubai and UAE? So when you talked about that and clarified that there are resources, we want to make sure that we engage these resources. One of the things that I've done is just call these numbers and ask questions, and they're very open to answering questions. I have a case that's XYZ. This is my concern. What do I do next? Who do I call? How do I follow up? They're very good about giving information out if we have the time and we make the time to call and ask the questions. At the bottom there, I think these slides will be shared. I'm not sure. Maddie will have to confirm for us. We have emergency helplines. So at Monarch, we just put up all the emergency helplines on one page to make it easier. You can go through them and decide which one you think is appropriate. At the bottom of the page, you'll find a form. It's a template that we've modified from the Saudi reporting entity. We have permission to share it and modify it. It is there. You can use it as a template and adjust it as needed. It's Arabic and English. Any reports that go to government authorities always have something in Arabic there. It's more likely to be picked up easily. Because this form is Arabic English, you can just check box the English and it'll correspond to the Arabic. Making sure as much as possible we have the child's ID, the parent's ID, and if at all possible, the perpetrator's ID. That's a little bit harder. If you can get a do, if you can't, you don't need it, but the child's ID and the parent's ID with contact information. As I said, I'll do a little pitch for Monarch. We're trying to do a lot of social changes, and one of the things we are doing is we have a scoliosis group, interpersonal process group, cancer support groups, in addition to a lot of different trainings for child protection and trauma-based. As I said, my specialty is on trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and as part of that, child protection is at the forefront. I believe we have time for questions.
Thanks, Dr. Sada. That was very informative, and thank you for sharing resources as well. I think we have time for just a couple of questions before we hit the 10 a.m. mark. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask Dr. Sada.
Can I ask one question? Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. And you have a genuine reason to believe that some sort of the child abuse is going on in a family setting. And before you report such an incident to the higher authorities, so would you tell the patients, the parents, this is what you are going to do in advance?
Yes. So I think that unless you're fearful for your life, which is very, very unlikely, the best thing to do is to have a conversation with the parents and say, this is how we're defining it and why we're defining it as something that needs to have additional resources. We have to choose words. Sometimes the word abuse, if we just mention abuse, the family gets defensive. So if we say to them instead, these are things that are concerning to me. I'd like to offer more help. I'd like to see what resources we can help your family get into place. They're more likely to say, yes, let's report together. I've had several incidences where I've literally had the conversation with the families and given them the phone. I call the number and tell the family, the mother, the father here, talk to them and tell them what's going on. They talk to the child protection division and say, these are the things that are happening. I need help. That's the best way to get protection.
Yeah, but most of the instances, the mother, she refuses to report the perpetrator. Can be her own husband. She doesn't want to put him into trouble, basically. So there is a strong resistance from the mother's side. Then how do you usually proceed?
So I always remind myself that the priority is not the mother's want, it's the child's safety. So if we're putting the child ahead of the mom, then we help explain to the mom why we're going to be doing what we're doing. We are mandated reporters, and that we have to report. That's when we have to look at our leadership and talk to them and know beforehand. Talk to them about how do I make these reports and what is the best way to do it. A lot of times I'll have social workers come in and sit with the clinician. They can have somebody from senior leadership come and talk to mom. There's cultural variations. They may have somebody else come talk to mom. One of the things that works in families, especially here, is that we have somebody that's more senior in the family talk to mom. So if the child's not in imminent danger, they can go and come back next week. We build a rapport with mom and have them bring in their senior uncle, a senior aunt, to the mother, somebody in the family that's more senior that can help them understand that we need to do this. And if she's afraid to report, then there may be a danger to the mother herself. So we have to ensure that by reporting, we're not putting the child and the mother into danger. It's a conversation to have. And typically, if not in that same setting, but within 1 to 2 settings, we can make the report.
Yeah. And it would be really useful if each center have a name, the child protection, the personnel who can speak the Arabic basically, so that they could, give the valuable advice to the clinicians as well as they could liaise with the families.
Right. So those kinds of persons would typically be a social worker that's trained as a child protection officer. So she knows the law too, typically. That's the ideal situation, and would be multicultural, multilingual, but we don't have those resources. So what we do is we look at customer happiness, executives, we look at any kind of person within an institution that is bilingual, and we have a conversation about who are the people that can be designated to help. And they are designated to help. They're not the person that we just call and walk out of the clinic because they don't have the clinical background. They don't have the supports then. We have to get them into support and stay there to help them.
Okay, then thanks for your advice. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. Great one.
Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Sara before we wrap up? No, it looks like we're all set. Thank you so much for giving us this talk. It was very, very helpful. And I personally wasn't aware of that many kind of initiatives and resources within the child protection kind of world within the UAE. So thank you very much for sharing that with us, Dr. Sara.
You're very welcome. I saw a chat question, will the resources be shared? So we just put them up on the website. It's on the slides. And you guys can ask Maddie, I guess, for the slides themselves. We're happy to share them.
Thank you so much.